Hi, I'm Bill DiGiulio. Today I'd like to talk about my overall concepts for soloing. I got a request on my YouTube channel asking me to discuss philosophically what I believe when it comes down to solos. I think I can boil this down into some concepts that make sense, so let me attempt to do that here. Okay, first let me just clarify for some listeners. The whole concept of improvisation is not found in all sorts of music, as you may know. For example, in classical music, obviously, the concept is to interpret the music. In other words, a composer will write out as closely as they can or exactly as they can what they want the music to sound like through notes and directions of various kinds. And then it's the performer's job to interpret that music and to communicate the emotional and musical intent of the composer to the audience. So in other words, there are no notes or chords or rhythms made up on the process. You're playing exactly what's there to the best of your ability to communicate what the composer wants. Now, of course, in an improvised solo, you're putting your interpretation, or in fact, not only interpretation, but your melodic and harmonic concepts into the song. And that's more a feature of course, pop, jazz, blues, rhythm, and folk music. Okay, so popular styles is where you'll find improvisation most commonly. I think there are elements of classical music that are improvised, but those are primarily late 20th century and are in the minority as far as pieces using in classical music. So the next question is, how do we want to look at soloing or improvisation? One concept you often hear is that a solo should be in spontaneous composition. In other words, we want to shoot for the same quality that a composer can get as far as the beauty or musical success of a melody that he or she has taken time to sit down and compose, that we want to get the same or approach the same level of quality, only we have to create our melody in real time. We don't have days or months to sit down with a piece of score paper and scratch out and correct. We have to do it right now in the moment, and it won't be heard before, and it will probably never be heard again. So that's the concept of spontaneous composition. Now, we have to think about some concepts that are appropriate to a good melody. What are some things that a good melody has that we want to shoot for in our composition, in our spontaneous composition, okay, our solo? One, I think, can be termed a sense of structure. In other words, the solo has clear ideas and a clear sense of form that the listener can appreciate. One way of looking at this is by playing clear phrases, the listener has a sense of structure. For example, in the blues, I'll play an example of a 12-bar blues. The structure that's built into 12-bar blues is its three phrases primarily. The first four measures are one idea, second four measures another idea, final four measures a third idea. So there is kind of a structure kind of built in. And I can follow that when I solo. I'll show you what I mean. I'll play a solo following that structure. So I'll play three clear segmented ideas. So that would be an example of three clear phrases following the structure of the 12-bar blues form. I could have just played continuous notes all the way through, and that could have been my solo. but it wouldn't have had a structure to it. It would have just been similar to run-on sentences. And I'll get more into that later on in this video. Now, another thing I think a solo should have, which emulates good melodies, is a sense of direction. In other words, there's a sense of progression to my solo. In other words, it starts somewhere, goes somewhere different, or develops in some way, and then possibly stays there or goes back down in terms of energy or in melodic ideas. Well, several ways to do this. One is to start slow, or with playing slow note, long note values, speeding up at the climax of the solo, and then tapering back down. Or possibly starting slow, building up, and then ending playing fast, having coming to the climax at the end of your solo. These are some ideas of how to have a sense of direction. Now, it can go in the other way too. If I'm in a band and say two other people have soloed before me, especially the person ended on a high note, I can continue building a lot of energy and then use my solo to taper down to prepare for the melody to come back in. So in both cases, notice there is a sense of direction to the solo. In other words, it's not just a lot of notes flying by. There's a concept there which the listener can hook into. I'll demonstrate that just so you see what I mean. So for sense of direction, I will start by playing a lot of long notes, increase the frequency of play faster, and then at the peak of the solo, have a built-in energy, have a lot of fast notes, and then taper back down at the end of my solo. So it sounds like I'm ending. So notice in that solo, I tried to have that, develop that sense of direction. And that can be done melodically also by starting low and getting up into the higher range. That would also lend a sense of direction to it. That's something that a lot of composers would do. And as I said, that's what we want to try to emulate when we improvise. Now, another thing that I think a solo should do, and I'll discuss how this can be done as well, is the solo has to in some way communicate to the listener. So in other words, the listener can hear this and have some sense of understanding what the soloist is trying to say or get across musically. You see this, when it's not done, you see this, a lot of people try to listen to jazz that are used to blues and pop, and they listen to a jazz solo and they say, well, I don't get it. It sounds just like a lot of fast notes flying by. I don't understand. That's primarily because they don't understand the language of jazz, which is different than the language of pop music and blues, for example. Okay? There are a lot of melodic and harmonic techniques that are used in jazz that are not present in those others. And if you're not sure what to listen to, you won't get any sense of what's going on in the solo. Just as if someone started speaking Korean to you and you didn't understand the Korean language, obviously it wouldn't make any sense. Now, it made plenty of sense to them because they speak the language, but it did not communicate. So the same thing in a solo. We have to follow the language of the style, first of all, and then try to use that language to say something to the listener. One way to do that is to make sure that the language we're using fits the style of the song. So, for example, if I'm playing a bebop solo, it probably wouldn't be appropriate to do a lot of heavy metal riffs or just a lot of chunking, power chords. That's not expected in a bebop solo. Is it wrong musically? Not necessarily. It could be creative. But it's just, it may not communicate what we want to say to a listener that expects to hear bebop if they're listening to jazz. Or the same thing, if I'm playing in a heavy metal band and I'm playing over a one-chord vamp, I probably don't want to do a lot of super heavily chromatic lines that would be fine for a Coltrane solo, Coltrane-inspired solo, but probably not in a heavy metal tune. It would sound foreign or out of place to a listener of heavy metal. So in other words, the solo has to speak the same language as the song and has to communicate appropriately to the listener. Now, another way we can do this, I think, is in the sense of by using clear phrases. As I mentioned before, in a sense of structure, by using clear phrases, we do like we do when we're writing or speaking our language. We speak usually in sentences separated by pauses, and then all those combined into paragraphs, chapters, etc., depending on how long we're writing. So I'll take a solo over the same progression, and this time I'll try to play very clear phrases. I'll break from my previous style of playing 3 long phrases. I'll break up the phrases to some degree into shorter ideas, but I'll still make them very clear. So notice in that song I tried to play very clear, distinct phrases with gaps, or not so much gaps, but silences between them to punctuate those. An example of not doing that would be this, the musical equivalent of run-on sentences. So notice in that case, I played notes that fit the changes, no problem there, but there was no sense of phrasing. There was no melodic idea, break, melodic idea, break, melodic idea. So that, I think, is a crucial sense of, or a crucial thing you want to hear in a solo. Okay. Another thing is the concept of what I like to call repetition versus new ideas. One thing you'll find in just about all cases in well-conceived compositions is there is a sense of, or a use of repetition musically. That could be harmonically, melodically, and the use of rhythm. One thing that repetition does is it lends a sense of unity to a composition. In other words, you could take the most common example, of course, which you've heard a million times, is in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. The entire first movement is based on 8 notes. For example, the main theme, which is, of course, so melodically, that entire movement is based on that concept. Notice he didn't do. He could have, okay, but the sense of repetition would not be there. Or if he started with that concept and then too quickly went off into other directions, it wouldn't have had such a sense of unity. Now, in contrast to that, we also need a sense of contrast and variety. If we play the same thing over and over, obviously that leads to a very monotonous solo or a very monotonous composition. So we have to find a balance between some form of repetition and some form of new material. Now, one way we do that, especially in improvisation, is by the use of thematic development. For example, and this of course ties into the sense of spontaneous composition, as I mentioned previously. So for example, I can play an idea, I can play a very similar idea or maybe the exact same idea, and then by the third time though, I usually want to introduce something slightly different or different enough so that there's a sense of variety into what I'm saying. I'll give an example. I'll play three phrase groups. I'll play two almost exactly the same. Then the third idea, I'll have a sense of variation. Now, usually after that, the next idea I play should probably be something somewhat different as well. By then, I'll want to go in a slightly different direction. So I'm walking a tightrope here. I have a sense of balance between repetition and new ideas. I'll demonstrate. So that would be an example of that. So notice I tried to strike that balance. Now, there is another issue that sometimes comes up when people discuss solos. What about solos in pop songs or in whatever form that are pre-prepared? For example, it was very common in especially late 80s, especially in heavy metal, where the soloist would play a solo that was pre-prepared in the song that was often very technically advanced and very technically amazing, but the solo was done every time in to exactly the same way. And of course now that's another way of structuring your song. There's nothing wrong with that. Then it's not an improvised solo, but it is an alternate solo in a song. If that's what you want to communicate musically, then of course that's fine. That's up to the band, the composer, the producer, however they want to do that. Okay, a similar example occurs in classical music. Okay, as you may know, in many concerti for different instruments in classical music, near the very end of the composition, there's something called a cadenza, which is most commonly written out by the performer, written out by the composer, and the performer will often play it exactly as written. But the soloist does have the option of inserting their own cadenza in there, either composed by themselves or composed by someone else. But usually it's not improvised in the moment. It's usually prepared ahead of time, since a lot of these materials are extremely technically demanding, and preparation is pretty much required to play them well. So that would be an analogy to that. And of course, that's a specific form of that type of music, so there's nothing wrong with it. But as we talk about in pop music, if we're dealing purely with improvisation, these are some elements that we'd like to see. Now, I'm being I'm giving you the overview here. I'm not going into too much detail. I'll do that in future videos or if requested. But these are just some of the things that I consider important in improvised solos. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I hope you've gotten something out of it. Have a great day.